Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Stadium Showdown, your in-depth look at the future home of the Cleveland Browns. I'm Jeff Slauson. We're slightly in a holding pattern for episode 40 this week because a judge has a temporary restraining order on the funds, the $600 million that's supposed to go from the state to the Cleveland Browns. So we are waiting a decision. Now, you may remember the Browns were supposed to get that funding on January 1st. Then just before Christmas, in the lawsuit with Mark Dan involved against the state saying that the funds taken from the Department of Unclaimed Funds should not be allowed, a judge agreed, at least in part, saying there needs to be more to be looked at, so we're putting some sort of a restraining order in this form. It's a temporary restraining order on the funds. So the Browns, who were supposed to get it on January 1st, have not gotten this yet. We have an interview with Mark Dan, who, again, is leading this lawsuit. Dan DeRose did that last week, or 2 weeks ago, excuse me. Before we get to that, I do want to touch on very briefly just where we are in this and why we're at this point. You may remember the Department of Unclaimed Funds. This is a lawsuit. This is an insurance claim, things like that. If you have not touched it in 10 years, it goes into a pot from the state. And the state can use the funds however they want. Now, you can still take that money out, but the state is saying they can spend that. And they're choosing to spend that on entertainment facilities, on sporting facilities, things like that. They took $1.7 billion out of the account in total. $600 million of that is supposed to go to the Cleveland Browns. Last year, late 2025, we were informed that yes, by January 1st, there is nothing to stop the funds from going through. Then, a couple days before Christmas, a massive decision. That temporary restraining order was put in place by a judge in Columbus, basically saying, we got to learn some more. Now, this week, we were supposed to get some clarity on that. The judge heard more arguments, but as of Friday, when we air this show, no decision has been made yet, so that will extend into next week. But again, this means the Browns do not have the funding. At the time, when this restraining order was put in place, 19's Dan DeRose spoke with Mark Dan, who is leading this lawsuit. Let's listen to the interview.
I think when I spoke to you this morning, I think you said it was a good day.
Yeah, it's an early Christmas present for people who think government shouldn't take your money without compensating you. Or without any due process of law. The judge, I think, saw clearly that we have a very good likelihood to succeed on this case, and appropriating other people's money to give a subsidy to the Cleveland Browns and other sports teams isn't a constitutional way to do it.
So let's expand on that just a little bit. The governor didn't want it done this way. The governor was hoping we would increase taxes on sports gambling, but the legislature saw it different, and this was passed by both the House and the Senate. The public is who votes those people into office. They voted for it, they passed it, and the governor signed it. I'm being devil's advocate. Why are you pushing so hard against what you could say is the majority?
Well, both the U.S. Constitution and Ohio's Constitution have very specific provisions that say if the government's going to take your money, first of all, they have to do it for a public purpose. And that money, and there's a Ohio Supreme Court decision right on point called Sogg versus Zers that says that money belongs to the owners of the money. So if you had a safety deposit box that was liquidated by the bank, or you had a stock account, or your relative died and you were entitled to insurance proceeds and the insurance company couldn't find you, all that money belongs to the people to whom it was intended, not to the state of Ohio. Ohio was holding it kind of like a lost and found. What the legislature in the middle of the night during the budget process back in June decided to do was to take that money as of January 1st, 2026 and keep it, and then use it to give a subsidy to sports and cultural facilities with a specific earmark of $600 million for the Cleveland Browns indoor stadium in Brook Park. And there's so many things that are offensive about this, but the fact is that it's the violation of the constitutional rights of the people that have money in that fund. And they're entitled to notice and the opportunity to have a hearing. For example, if they sell your stock in Apple, depending on when they sold it, the value of that stock may be different than the state thinks it is. You're entitled to a hearing on to determine that amount. If the state takes your money for anything, it has to be for a public purpose. I think there's a really good argument that it's not a public purpose to build an indoor stadium for a billionaire. And then third, if there is, even if the court were to decide, or it was a public purpose to build an indoor stadium for a billionaire, then you have to compensate the people whose property you're taking for that, and you have to do it under Ohio's constitution before you take it. So, and this happens a lot in the context of like roads. If they want to put a new road through your neighborhood, the state can do it, but they have to compensate you for it. They have to give you notice and the opportunity to be heard on what your property's worth. And then a jury can decide how much that property's worth. That's what every person in the unclaimed funds fund should be entitled to.
And just going to play devil's advocate again, they're not taking all of the $4 billion. They're taking 1.7, and they're taking some of the oldest money that's been sitting there, 10, 20 years that it's been sitting there. Explain that side of it, that, you know, they're not saying that you can't claim your money anymore. There's still going to be a sizable amount of money sitting there that people can claim money.
But what the judge said, I thought, was very apt, and he said that they're robbing Peter to pay Paul. They're saying that if you do make a claim on those funds after we've transferred them to the state, then those funds can come from somebody else's money that's been put in the unclaimed funds account. And it's a slippery slope when government starts to take your property without giving you due process of law or compensating you for what they've taken.
So what would make you happy that? Let's say, and I'm just going to make up John Q. Public. There is a guy, John Smith, that has had money sitting in that account for 35 years. It's $20. That should never be touched. John Q. Public is dead. They have no family that they can track down. That money should just sit there forever?
Well, they should have, from the time they took it, they should have notified individually John Q. Public, and that's not what's happened here. Those funds, so they put the burden of notifying people whose money goes into the unclaimed funds account on the bank or the institution that's submitting the money. The government doesn't control that. The government doesn't. You don't get a letter, official letter from the government saying your money's been seized and is going to be held by the state of Ohio. So there's no and for under $50, you don't even get that. You get nothing at all. So John Q. Public would have had no idea that he had, or certainly legally no idea, that he had money in that fund, and no opportunity to raise claims about the value of it and whether he owned it or not.
But I'm sure it'll be argued by the other side. There's been a website for 10, 15 years that anyone in the public can go look up their name. So that's going to be the argument for the other side. This isn't coming out of the blue. This wasn't something.
But that notice, and that notice has probably never been constitutional. The state's required to provide individualized notice, and I think that's a pretty clear legal standard. And none of it has taken place. Now the state wants to take it a second time. So they took it once and held it in trust. So it's not a taking because the state wasn't using that money for whatever purposes the General Assembly decided to use that money. That money was off limits. Suddenly, in the middle of the night in the budget process, they decided, okay, we're going to tap into that money. Rather than have the courage, if necessary, to raise taxes to reward our campaign contributor Jimmy Haslam and to send money to the Cleveland Browns Stadium, we're going to take your money and do it, but we're not going to give you any individualized notice of that. For example, one of our clients' name is John Reed. I encourage you, Dan, to take a look at the Unclaimed Funds website and see how many John Reeds there are. For him to identify what funds he has in there to even raise these issues is a challenge for somebody in that situation. So the state is just not doing its job. It is not meeting the requirements of the state constitution, and that's what the judge decided today.
So this is now being pushed to January 8th. I mean, something has to move here. You've got a 14-day window. This payment was supposed to be made on January 1st. What happens January 8th?
January 8th, there's another hearing for what's called a preliminary injunction, and we have to once again prove that one that we're going to be successful on the case, and I think that we'll be able to do that, and two, that the state wouldn't be harmed by just maintaining the status quo, and I don't think the state would be harmed in any way. And then the court can decide in an appropriate process for a lawsuit to take place over the course of the next several months, whether or not this process is constitutional or not. If we're right, then a permanent injunction would issue, and it would never happen. If we're wrong, then the state can go ahead and what they call sheet that money, which just is a nice word for stealing, and use it for whatever purposes that they want to use it. I feel very confident in our case, and I think that we'll. At the end of the day, is there a constitutional way for the state to do it? Yes, but it takes the courage to provide individualized. What they wanted this all to happen was, this bill was passed in the middle of the night. They wanted to go under everybody's radar. That nobody will even know that their money was taken. It was they thought they had committed the perfect crime here, but they got caught, and they have to follow the rules, and the rules that we set for how the General Assembly is to behave is in the Ohio Constitution, and how the administration in carrying out the wishes of the General Assembly is to behave. And that is that if you're going to take somebody's property, and this goes back to the Revolutionary War. Remember the history class where the British soldiers were quartering in the homes of the American revolutionaries. When we won that war, we decided we didn't want the government to be able to do that. There's no kings here anymore, and so the government has to give you notice, give you the opportunity to be heard, and if they're going to take your property for a public purpose, they have to do it. They have to do it by compensating you. And if they're going to take your property to give to a private individual to build a monument to himself in an indoor stadium, then they can't do it at all.
And coming up after the break, I explain why the timeline here is so important and why it is such a big deal that the Browns don't have the funding already, despite the fact that they have a few years to build the stadium. I'll break that down after a short break. Welcome back. The timeline around this is incredibly important when you consider how much needs to actually be done in Brook Park before the Browns can play their first game. Now, there is an option in the current lease to extend it a couple of years, so it's not necessarily that massive, but it can be. This thing can start to snowball if a decision's not made quick on the funding or the Browns don't find another source of income. Just to start off here, let's just go to the graph. We've shown this multiple times over the last year or so, how the stadium is getting paid. Now remember, the whole facility is more than $3 billion. This is just the stadium portion. The Haslams, through multiple negotiations, because the county's not participating in anything, Brook Park's not really participating in anything, $1.8 billion is what the Haslams are putting forward. They are getting help from the state in the form of $600 million. So this is the total that the state has to put forward. The thing is, as of right now, that's not potentially happening. So there's a chance that the Haslams could be on the hook for the entire thing. That would be $2.4 billion, at least until the state figures it out. So why is this such a big deal? It is all in the timeline itself. So let's start off on the timeline here. There we go. To explain that. Q1 of 2026, potentially Q2 of 2026, is when construction was supposed to start. Now, if you know anything about any major construction project, you will know that it rarely happens the way it's supposed to, right? They will say it will be a 2.5-year, 3-year timeline. Things always go wrong. Construction almost always is delayed. I covered development when I was a reporter in Buffalo, New York, and I can assure you that almost every single project that I covered as the development reporter was delayed in some way, or at least stretched in some way. So Q1 of 2026 is when construction was supposed to begin. 2028, the Browns lease ends at Huntington Bank Field downtown, right? So the Brown Stadium lease downtown, the lease ends. There is an option to extend it for $1 million and $2 million for 2 more years. So there's a chance that it would extend into 2030. But as of right now, 2028, they no longer have a home. Again, they could extend it, but we will have to see. Because the plan is to demolish it as soon as that season's done. 2029 is when the Browns need to be playing their first game in Brook Park. Now, there is, again, leeway, but this just shows you why it's so necessary to kind of get this handled. If they're going to start construction in 2026, they got to be out of the stadium by 2028 and be playing by 2029. That's the timeline that they've established. So there's not much room for error. In fact, the Browns are saying that by March, April, May, basically Q2 of 2029, a lot of stuff's going to already be built around it. They're going to have the stadium there. They might have some shops ready to go. So they're planning to have this thing ready to roll by this summer and be able to hold events before that first Browns game. So here's the thing. If they don't figure out the funding now, that obviously pushes back Q1 of 2026 of the construction because they don't have the full funding. Maybe they can start some of it, but you're not going to start it if you don't have plans to be able to fill out the rest of it, right? So if that gets delayed, that moves things a little bit further here. Maybe they do have to extend their lease into 2029, 2030. That would mean that potentially the first game could be 2030 or 2031. That's how this starts to snowball. There's also, again, the construction aspect to all of this. So I looked at 3 of the more recent stadiums to open. These 2 are both domes. The Bills' new stadium is going to be opening next season. They just played their last game in the old stadium. The new stadium for the Buffalo Bills, 3 years to build. Basically to the date. It's going to be almost to the day that it was going to be the grand opening. Grand opening is going to be happening in, I think, July or June. That's when they started construction. So exactly 3 years. Key thing here, this was cheaper than the Brown Stadium and not a dome, okay? Also, they got way more funding from the state than the Browns did. The Raiders, this is a dome stadium, 2.7 years. Basically, it started from November to about the summer, right? Early summer. This is a dome stadium. This is in Las Vegas. There was also much more of a necessity to get it done quickly because the Raiders didn't have a home. They were leaving Oakland. They did not have a home to go to because Oakland said, fine, you're leaving. You can't stay here. You got to go somewhere else. So they really needed a place. That place ended up being their new stadium, so 2.7 years. Then you have the high end here. The Rams, SoFi Stadium, which is a massive complex, not necessarily apples to oranges. $3 billion essentially was that one. 5 years to build. Okay, so this is where this becomes tricky. Not much leeway here. Let's say that the average is about 3 to 3.5 years on the construction, right? You go back to this point, 3 to 3.5 years from Q1 of 2026 brings us to 2029. The thing needs to be done by August, essentially, if you're saying it needs to go by the Browns' schedule to make sure they can play their preseason games in the new stadium. There's not a whole lot of leeway here. Q1 of 2026, 3 years from that is Q1 of 2029. If it goes to 3.5 years, you're butting right up to August. So that's why this is so tricky. And that's why figuring out the funding is so important to the Browns, to the Haslams, to Brook Park. We've asked Brook Park multiple times how they feel about this. They've said, look, we don't handle any of the financials, but it's still important. The more things get delayed, the more they have to make a decision on 2030, 2029, those Browns seasons. Not saying that the funding will or will not go anywhere, but that is still very important. Of course, the last thing to have to discuss here, very briefly, what happens if this portion officially is said, look, you cannot go to the Browns? Not saying that will happen, but what if that does happen, right? The Haslams would either have to fork over the original amount to get to the 2.4 or find additional investors. They were able to do that because initially the Haslams were only at 1.2 billion, then they upped it to 1.8 billion. There's a chance they could just say, you know what, we'll take all 2.4, but that obviously would need to be figured out as well. All right, coming up after the break, a look ahead at next week. We have a very large meeting that's taking place. Let's say that the building process is going to go exactly as planned. How that's going to affect the people of Brook Park. We have all of that coming up after a short break. Welcome back. Before we end the show here, I want to discuss what's going to be happening next week. NOACA, that is the Northeast Ohio Area-Wide Coordinating Agency. We've talked about them before. Very long acronym. They have a meeting next week. It's going to be at 10 a.m. In the middle of the week, on Wednesday, I believe. This is going to be a big one. The Browns, Brook Park, they will all be in attendance because this is going to be discussing the transportation impacts of a new stadium. They've done studies, they've done analysis, they've looked at the airport, they've looked at the highway, they've looked at the streets around it. Basically what they do is they compile all this information and then offer recommendations as far as how things should proceed, and then again, the potential impacts. Now, we aren't going to know officially what those impacts are, obviously, until everything's built, but this is still very important. We've heard concerns from people that live in the area. And we all know the concerns, right? Brook Park has had industrial businesses, but nothing to this scale. So what happens when you put it there? This should answer those questions. We will have a full report from there. I'm going to guess we're going to have Brittany Weir there. She's been on top of all information related to Brook Park, but that is what's to come next week. We're hoping to get a little bit more info as far as the actual transportation impacts that we have seen from the current Brook Park situation, and then what we will see once the stadium is there. And of course, if you want to watch any of our previous coverage, scan the QR code on your screen right now. That has every single episode. And yeah, as this is episode 40, we appreciate all of the viewership that we have gotten. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Jeff Slauson here with 19 News. We'll see everybody next week for that very important transportation meeting. Hopefully, more answers to the questions that we've been having related to the impacts of the new stadium. See everybody then.